Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I really appreciate any time that I get to talk about information architecture to a new group of people. So thank you for inviting me. So I want to talk about my origin story with information architecture because I think that mine is not all that different from a lot of folks. So the very first time that I encountered the idea of being an information architect as a job was in the summer of 2004. I had just graduated from design school and I was hustling on Craigslist looking for freelance graphic design work. So I found this listing to design some icons for some banking software for a bank that was in Bermuda. Now, 20 years later, I can't help but admit how unsafe that ad actually sounds just by the description. Even worse than the title was it was one of those jobs that I now know to be putting lipstick on a pig. The interface team was building the pig, and I was the one with the lipstick experience that they needed. I designed those icons without ever seeing the interface, and they looked great. They were right on to brand and image specification in the PDF, which I delivered them on. When I did encounter the interface with the icons, all 12 lined up as a thick stripe across the top, I felt ill. I knew in my designer heart of hearts that this was just not right. It looked overwhelming, it was unclear, and I had to say something. So I did. I told the project managers who had hired me how poorly I thought the icons were going to work as navigation. And he asked me what I would suggest instead. One whiteboard session and my first professional navigation schema later, I was asked the question that ultimately led me to a career in information architecture. Do you know what information architecture is? Now, my dear listener, I did in fact think that I knew what information architecture was at this point in the story. I had recently graduated from design school, where information architecture was neatly tucked into a 2-semester course focused on designing print materials, mostly to influence and inform. Among other projects, I designed a poster to encourage students to vote. What I didn't yet know about information architecture is what I am here to talk to you about today. So my teachers were not wrong 25 years ago when I was taught that IA was in what IA was in the context of graphic design. But what I have learned since is how small they had attempted to make information architecture. I've since learned how far reaching the concept of IA is and how powerful a practice it is across mediums, fields, and industries. Now, in graphic design, a good information architecture is needed, just like in interface design, a good information architecture is needed. Just like in wayfinding and signage design, a good information architecture is needed. Repeated 1,000 times over for all of the messes that I have heard people making sense of by thinking about the information architecture. Information architecture is the way that we arrange the pieces of something to make sense as a whole. Now, by that definition, IA can be applied to pretty much any endeavor. Whether we're talking about the way we arrange the pieces of a ballot to make sense as a whole, or the way we arrange the pieces of our next presentation to make sense as a whole, information architecture is all around us. Now, the information architecture of this presentation is at the helm at the moment, although we'll only think about it if things go really wrong. The announcement of this lecture offering, the invitation, the way I was introduced, what I have said and shown so far, it all matters to how this presentation makes sense as a whole. Now, I don't claim to know what each of you is personally responsible for, but I can tell you based on where you work alone, information architecture problems are all around you. Now, the first section of this talk will be focused on when information architecture is needed. The second section will be focused on who is influencing information architectures. And the third section will be on identifying common IA patterns. If all goes to plan, I hope that we'll have some time for questions at the end. So thoughtful attention to information architecture is needed on more specific things than are worth naming here, but there are some patterns to when attention to IA is most needed. If there is a word or a phrase that trips people up, or a misnomer in the way of understanding, more thoughtful attention to IA is a great first step to take. It is incredibly common to have things that we make use language that makes sense to us. And if we aren't careful, we can lose our audience by using language that's just too complex, inconsistent, or confusing in any number of ways. If language is in the way, information architecture is at play. Clarifying a single word within an organization can ease the tension that builds when we don't know what we mean when we say what we say. One of the best examples I saw of this in my career was advising a large company to change the word customer to retailer to ease the predictable drama that occurred when they were serving consumers, people buying their products directly, and customers, people buying their products to sell to consumers. The issue with these two words was that they are too close in how they sound and look. By changing one to something that set itself apart, we eliminated a ton of flubs and documentation nightmares that arose from serving two audiences very differently while calling them such similar things. Number two, when you don't have a full picture of it yet. If you're making something and you don't have a way to visualize it in its entirety, you are missing out on a major opportunity. Taking something down to or up to a mappable level is an exercise in systems thinking that more information architectures need to be stronger. If you aren't careful, we can actually end up with blinders on to our own context when the reality is that the information flows up and downstream. If you don't have a full picture of whatever it is yet, the information architecture just isn't as resilient as it could be. About a decade ago, there was an investigation into General Motors for their lack of action to fix a critical flaw in the ignition of the Chevy Cobalt, starting as far back as 2002. The 325-page report can best be summed up by this excerpt quote describing the decade-plus corporate bungle as due to failure to understand, quite simply, how the car was built. A decision made on a low-level detail, like a piece of an ignition switch hardware, can have a massive impact. And a high-level picture of how things connect forces the level of forethought that most information architectures deserve given the intentions behind them. Number three, when you serve multiple audiences. If you are trying to balance how to serve multiple audiences, there is a whole other layer of complexity that's added. These are the types of challenges where the information architecture tends to really need thoughtful attention. The more diverse the needs amongst the audience, the more thoughtful attention might be needed. For example, let's say that we are a restaurant where there is both a front of house and a back of house need. For every decision that we make for the front of house, the back of house is impacted. If we add cloth napkins, we impact the staff in having to launder and fold them. If we use paper napkins, we increase the level of trash to be dealt with by that same staff. In a case like that, balancing both audiences is a part of the reality that an information architecture needs to be considerate of in order to be effective. So, whether you're designing for internal or external users, multiple types of customers in a retail environment, or something that has to work well for doctors and patients, or taxpayers and legislators, the balance of multiple audiences is a primary place where more thoughtful attention to IA might yield you better results. Number four, when a multi-step process is involved. If step A leads to step B, information architecture is something that should be deeply paid attention to. And for every step that you add, the complexity of what you are asking for from others or yourself mounts. Without a clear sense of the process and thoughtful attention to how the pieces make sense as a whole, processes can feel wild and cumbersome. When thoughtful attention is paid, we mostly don't notice the process at all, as we can remain focused on the results. I recently had a multi-hour waiting experience at a local government office. And during this time, I watched as a man served the part of a sign that no one was reading. The sign said, "Your number might be called out of order." The problem was that the sign was in the wrong place. It was at the kiosk where you sign in, not on the sign with all of the numbers coming up as people were called. This security guard seemed to spend 50% of his effort dedicated to either proactively saying, "Hey, folks, don't freak out if the numbers are called out of order," or reactively having to reassure confused people coming up to his desk, sheepishly thinking that they missed their number being called. Now, this is a classic IA issue. You have the information that the audience needs. Step one, check. Now, we need to get that information to them in whatever places we can know that they might receive it. Now, this is the drama involved in even the most simple of processes. Five, when change is afoot. People do not like change. If change is a part of what you are doing, paying careful attention to the information architecture you are about to influence is critical in risk prevention and due diligence. We need to know what something is before we can know how to change it. And if you don't have the before picture, the after picture might be dangerously not realistic enough to withstand real use out in the real world. And that is the perfect segue to tell you the story of the time that I spent working for Nike to help to bring their sales process onto a digital platform. Now, if that sounds like it's something that should have happened a long time ago, you're right. This story is actually from 2012. And even then, they were, as many brands were, and some still are, woefully underprepared for the realities and implications of the information age. And that's where IA stepped in. In 2012, Nike engaged a team from a digital agency to develop a single digital platform to serve 120,000 internal users in 9 languages. I was brought onto the team to help lead a group of Nike executives and RGA designers to agree on an information architecture for the platform. I worked on this project for approximately 9 months. Now, Nike is a global brand that releases 22,000 products 4 times a year to 50,000 retailer accounts. To manage their digital sales process, there was a set of 20 disparate digital tools that had emerged from various teams and selling contexts over a decade of moving into digital sales. Their tools lacked a common language or data structure, and there was no clear picture of how these tools could be brought together over time. The 96-week cadence of interconnected business processes that would better support the company from product conception to quarterly sales was largely undocumented as a dream that the sales team and executive team at Nike had. I spent significant time at the start of this project interviewing all of the stakeholders at Nike to get a documented understanding of their business goals and the opportunities and challenges that they saw. I recruited users of different roles and aptitudes in the current digital tools to interview and shadow in their use of the current tools and processes. These interviews allowed me to start to really understand the jobs that those users were trying to get done and to start to identify places where better digital tools would help them the most. I worked through a series of collaborative workshops where we mapped out in detail the end-to-end 96-week sales process. And from these workshops, I paired with a business analyst at Nike to produce a detailed diagram that the team could use as a reference for how the platform was being built and how it should ideally unite these otherwise disconnected business processes. I facilitated a series of workshops where agency designers and Nike executives sketched alongside each other to explore features and ideas that could better serve users on the platform. And I used these in-person meetings as a way to build a shared context and create the right environment to have open discussions about really tough problems that the team had to face together. These workshops were absolutely exhausting, but were so pivotal in our team's ability to come together around solving problems for the users. I developed a systematic way for the team to break up the larger map into user stories that could be discreetly explored from a design and tech perspective. And then I worked with a designer to bring storyboards to life with high fidelity visuals that we could show the vision to the leadership team, but also a more narrative way to teach the engineers and designers on the team about the business context. I collaboratively worked through the definition of all of the core terms that were important to understand within both the business and the technology spaces being explored, and this document served as a guide to how to talk to each other about the work that we were doing. I developed this framework for identifying and quantifying the value of each potential feature that we could explore the development of. And in this framework, I captured details about how features map to user roles, how much impact we expected to have with a particular feature, and the level of effort for implementation and release. This framework became a critical planning tool for the team to rally around as we determined where to spend our resources. And I developed a visualization framework to communicate our phased rollout plans for the stakeholders who needed to understand the pieces, but not get lost in the weeds. This set of diagrams became the go-to for team members to reorient themselves on what problems were being solved in the short versus the long term. Now, the work I did on this project served as the strategic underpinning for an agency design and client-side engineering team that worked in this space for 5 years after this project's conclusion. The goal of this project at the end of the day was to become more informed, and I was able to use IA to do just that. But I often think about how many projects are just as complex as this one, but are assigned to design and engineering teams without a thoughtful starting place or any structure to hold all of the bits together. Perhaps the scariest thing that I will say today is that the information architecture of what you are working on already exists. The success of that IA at helping you reach your intentions is a matter of how much thoughtful attention you're giving to influencing it over time. So I wanted to encourage you to find the places where thoughtful attention to IA might help. Where is the complexity of language getting in the way? What don't you have a full picture of yet? How are you balancing two or more audiences? How clear are the multi-step processes involved in your work? Are you ready to change what you need to be prepared for? And in case this first section has left you wondering whose job it is to do all this and wondering how much of it is actually maybe yours to do, our next section will focus on what roles influence an IA and how. All right. So now that we've established when influencing an IA might be prescient, let's talk about the question of who influences it. The short, pedantic answer is everyone does. And I truly believe in that. In fact, I wrote a book called How to Make Sense of Any Mess, which is a book about information architecture for everybody. And I think everybody plays the role of information architect in their work or in their personal endeavors. Deciding how to arrange and label things is just a basic part of human life. And the need to arrange and label things thoughtfully increases as the size of the audience increases. Let's look at a typical organization and how information architecture tasks might apply to that variety of roles. In operations, we're arranging and labeling processes. In finance, we're arranging and labeling goals and results. In product, we're arranging and labels products and features. In research, we're arranging and labeling methodology and findings. In design, we're working on elements and flows. In management, we're labeling and grouping people and their priorities. In sales, we're talking about arranging and labeling benefits and offerings. And in things like content development, we're labeling assets, metadata, and messaging. So let's say that we're making a very simple web page. We need an engineer, a UX designer, a researcher, and a writer. Who's doing the IA? A, all of them. B, the UX designer. Or C, none of them. The answer is all of them are influencing the information architecture. The engineer is labeling pages, components, datasets, variables, and arranging database tables and code bases. The UX designer is deciding the hierarchy of content on the page, as well as establishing the right calls to action and navigation paths. The researcher is providing data to influence what is being presented and how, and including what the language is that is going to be used. The writer is proposing the right words to achieve the intention of the group and make sense to the user. These are all things that deeply impact the information architecture of this simple web page being built. When we ask questions like, who does the IA, we can put IA into too small of a box. We can start believing that the information architecture is only the navigation mechanisms on the website, when really every bit, bob, zero, and one has been put there to make sense as a whole. Now, in this section, I want to focus on three types of work that can be really helpful when attempting to positively influence an information architecture, no matter what your role. I want to talk about research, I want to talk about diagrams, and then we're going to talk about controlled vocabularies. So research into your user and your context are essential when seeking to influence an information architecture. And research can be helpful at any and every stage of a project. But some common methods for information architecture research include card sorting and tree jack testing. So card sorts help us to understand how our audience arranges and labels groups of things. There are two types of card sorts, open and closed. Open card sorting is when you allow the users to make their own categories to the sort, and you provide the cards that they sort into. The closed sorting is when you provide both the categories and the cards for the sort to be performed on. Now, generally, open card sorts are useful for exploration of mental models and common groupings, and closed card sorts are useful when testing out a set of groups that you've already feel really confident in. These are some of the example findings from some category work done on Etsy.com while I was working there as their senior staff information architect. In these examples, buyers were asked to categorize hard to categorize items. The sample size for this test was quite small, with only 8 buyers, but look at the variety of placements for some of these items. But then again, I kind of wonder, where would I categorize a John Hamm coloring book? My favorite response was to put it in vintage, I guess because Mad Men. And I don't know about you, but I would also classify my satanic altar kit as home and office. I will say that Etsy was never lacking in fun and interesting examples of outliers. Next is tree jack testing. So tree jack testing allows us to test how effective or efficient our navigation taxonomy is for a certain audience and a certain task. So TreeJect testing is the best way to know how effective a navigation proposal is. You give the participant a task and they navigate to where they think that task would be enabled for them. You can therefore see if you've made a navigation that is actually intuitive and navigable by your target audience. In this case, from an Optimal Workshop blog, people are looking for an electric screwdriver, and while products was the right location for this content, there was something about the labels underneath it that made 28% of total visitors think that they were in the wrong place and turn back. In a case like this, we don't know exactly what is wrong from this finding, but we have a place to start in the user flow to go looking for more insight. In addition to those and other IA-specific research methods, there are also a number of more traditional user research methods that are invaluable to the IA process. Stakeholder interviews can help us make sense of an internal environment. User interviews help us make sense of users' mental models. Usability testing can help us make sense where a current IA is the weakest or the strongest. And A/B testing can help us make sense of the myriad of options that we have for getting to the how part of what we do. Before you even open my second book, Stuck Diagrams Help, I define a diagram as a visual representation that is helpful to someone, even if that someone is you. By that definition, a lot of things fit. So for this section, I want to focus on 3 of the most common diagrams used to influence information architectures: hierarchies, journeys, and flows. From representing the arrangement of flora, fauna, or people into groups to designing experiences with nested content, hierarchy maps are incredibly useful. One of the reasons for that is how hard it is to keep complex relationships in our head. I want you to close your eyes and let's try an example. I want you to listen to this, no notes, as I describe a small team with just 7 members. Yulhi, Nikita, and Jose report to Maggie. They each manage 1 intern. Yulhi is managing Mark, Nikita is managing Mel, and Jose is managing Carl. Got it? Question: who is the highest ranking person on the team? Now, if you answered Maggie, you are very good at paying attention. But if you felt assaulted by my question after that fire hose of words and names, I see you, and you are why this example is important. Now, let's take a look at a hierarchy diagram illustrating these same relationships. The answer to my question now seems silly, as the diagram has made it so obvious. Now, hierarchy diagrams are helpful when visualizing groups of people and have been helpful to people across a range of contexts since at least 500 CE, where this form of diagram was used to track lineage and heritage of families and tribes. Journey maps are wonderful at visualizing getting from point A to point B given a range of emotion or changes in context. This type of diagram forces us to zoom out, but also focus on a single object's experience through a series of related tasks, events, and decision points. If you're having one of those right now, we don't have a full enough picture yet of moments that we talked about earlier. A journey map can be the next great step. The format is fairly simple. Use the y-axis to represent a range of emotion, status, or context, and the x-axis to represent the flow of time. Using this format, you add milestones of whatever journey you're representing in order to visualize them in relationship to the whole. While working for Herman Miller, a luxury furniture company, I was battling the fact that the digital team was having a hard time getting their metrics in line with what seemed to be expected consumer behavior. They were heavily invested in their mobile shopping experience, but seeing what they saw as negative conversion rates. After doing some customer research, a hypothesis was formed. What if they didn't want to buy a $5,000 chair on their phone immediately after viewing it for the very first time? What if instead the consideration process, even for the wealthy, involved a trip to the showroom, a call with a dealer, or even a consultation with a family member or a friend or designer? By visualizing this other possibility for the team, they were able to see how the way that they were measuring the mobile experience was just all wrong. They had put it into its own box, when really it was just one tool in the toolbox of their customers. I like this example because it's fairly simple. We used a 5-step process for the x-axis, and the team understood that from the marketing funnel perspective: awareness, interest, desire, action, and post-purchase. Then we use the y-axis to show the peaks and valleys of their actual interaction with the brand-provided digital tools and marketing efforts. Each colored line represents a type of communication or service that a typical user encounters. And the Herman Miller brand, competitive messages, family and friend, customer services, all of those add up to what the experience is for a single customer. Flow diagrams are commonly found documenting processes across any number of fields. Something I learned while writing Stuck was that doctors use flow diagrams to diagnose patients. Which was a good thing because in August of 2022, Paul Wicks, a neuroscientist, booked a one-on-one with me to talk about diagrams. He'd recently gotten my book and was interested in whether diagrams could help him make sense of the mess in front of him. In this example, Paul made sense of the flow of decisions and data points involved in a program designed to increase proactive genetic screening for ALS. Working with Paul to tell his very personal and inspiring story at my Make Sensemas event in 2022 was a true pleasure. And diagramming was attributed in his story as a huge part of what helped him make sense of a rather large and complex mess. As someone who saw his mess on the way to this rather simple looking diagram, I can attest to how much work is behind all of those boxes and arrows. Memes even use flow diagrams to educate the masses. Have you potentially seen this one on Mansplaining by Kim Goodwin? It's one of my favorite diagrams on the internet. And engineers use flow diagrams to allocate resources and uncover dependencies and complexities. Take this picture of the complexity hiding behind your Slack notification preferences. This is a great example of how much thought has to go into what seems like a simple set of features. Making a diagram like this is more than just capturing it. It is a delicate art of thoughtfully arranging the pieces to make sense as a whole. We can use flow diagrams to capture a process that we think we already know and realize in doing so how much of it has been taken for granted, lost to assumptions, and only consistent in its inconsistency. Of all the diagrams that I use regularly, flow diagrams are the ones that I turn to when I want to keep myself honest. So hierarchy diagrams are good for sorting out group and subgroups of people, places, or things. Journey diagrams are good for visualizing action in relation to a range of emotion or changes in context. And flow diagrams are good for digging into the details of logic behind a process or decision. If you want to dig into diagrams in your work and expand your toolbox beyond these three types, I recommend my book Stuck, Diagrams Help. One of my favorite diagrams that I have ever made in my career is this one that I made to guide readers to the right diagrammatic recipe to start from. And I still use this one myself all the time. Lastly, I want to tell you all about the most boring, but also most undervalued method, the dark art of controlling vocabulary. I've seen this done by spreadsheets, ontology software, and even poster campaigns in bathrooms. For example, on that Nike project that I walked through in the last section, I resorted to blowing a gym whistle that I wore around my neck every time someone accidentally used a retired term. Controlled vocabularies are just lists of words, which in my opinion is what makes them so powerful. These lists of words seem unassuming in their ask. How hard could it be to define the word that we use all the time? Yet time and time again, this is where the ghosts come out. The cans of worms are open, the bodies are found, and any other metaphor that I could use in this situation. And if you think that this is only in reality in software or in designing user experiences, you would be sorely mistaken. There are millions of language-based controversies, some of which are central to our understanding of existence. Take this example from the New York Times doing a deep dive on the idea that, are you ready for it? Scientists don't actually yet agree on the definition of the word species. From giraffes to bears to frogs, the moment when evolution splits creatures into multiple species is surprisingly not yet agreed to. So, the truth of the matter is that most information architecture work is done by people that don't have the title information architect and have no clue that it's even called information architecture. So, as we close the second section of today's session, I want to encourage you to start to see the IA in your current role. What are the things that you are responsible for labeling and structuring for others? What are you responsible for arranging the pieces of? Who is the audience that your work has to make sense to? How much influence does your work have on the information architectures around you? And can you see places in your sphere of influence where research, diagramming, or controlling vocabularies might help make sense of things that don't make too much sense right now? Arranging things and labeling them for other people is a gift that you can give to others and a skill that you can hone for yourself in pretty much any context. But to help you figure out where you might look for IA problems to solve, I want to end with some common elements influencing an IA across digital and physical experiences. When you're walking through an airport that you've never been to, yet you can find your way through security, find a restaurant, and eventually your gate, this is all thanks to the important work done in support of what's called wayfinding. Now, wayfinding is the process of figuring out where we currently are and where we can or should go next. Whether we're moving through an airport or an e commerce website, whenever we are navigating, we are using our wayfinding to do so. When we create or enable experiences for other people, navigation and wayfinding are two of the core considerations to make. In my humble opinion, navigation is not just about wayfinding. It also is one of the clearest expressions of brand, tone, and voice that we can let it be. And when living their best lives, navigation systems allow us to project the best version of ourselves. When I worked at Etsy, we ran some navigation research where we recruited users without any Etsy brand awareness. And we asked them each to describe what they thought the site was from what they could see in the navigation alone. They determined that it was, quote, a lot like Kmart or other discount shopping place. And for a hip Brooklyn-based e-commerce rising behemoth, this was a very shocking thing to hear. And ultimately, a major driver in selling the return on investment in rethinking the main category navigation for the entire website. Even when the branding, products, and interfaces feel hip and fresh, if your navigation sounds or feels crusty and dusty, your true intention will be overshadowed, and users will even make stuff up about who they think you are and what you stand for. Facets are what we know about the content that we are organizing. In digital products, this layer often takes the form of metadata or attributes that we capture about the content that we are managing. We use facets to determine what to show where to whom. Now, the easiest way to see facets in action is to think about those little filter panels that you see on list interfaces, where you can filter by things like size or material or color. Here are a few examples of the faceted navigation of Amazon, Etsy, and Kmart. Now, think about examples from a clothing website where each piece of clothing has a category. That category is just one piece of metadata. The color, style, price, and any other pieces of metadata might be available for each piece of clothing. Some of this metadata, like the category, might be then used to build navigational devices. Now, when we're working with content, digital or not, we need to know where the content comes from because we also need to know who made it, when it was made or last edited, tags that's been given, and the rating that it has with readers, etc., in order to populate interface devices. I was part of a team at Etsy that was exploring inferring metadata about items that had been uploaded to the platform by sellers. In our first round, we identified 20 metadata attributes that had low adoption from users that we felt confident in our machine learning model to assist in inferring the metadata and then presenting it for user confirmation. Once confirmed by the user, we could then use that inferred data to make more powerful filters and personalization experiences throughout the product. What we know about the content we are arranging massively impacts how much we can influence the information architecture. Now, one of the saddest things that I ever witnessed in my 20 years of IA service was in a meeting that was late in my time at Etsy, where I attended a showcase of design ideas, where Etsy designers were asked to really push the envelope. And at the end, every person was asked for feedback. And the feedback was all glowing about the ideas being so innovative and creative and useful. But having spent as much time in the bowels of the data structures of their metadata, my feedback was that Etsy would have to invest significant time and resources into the back end before a single idea could even be experimented with at a useful scale. Metadata makes or breaks many information architectures. So don't let bad metadata happen to you. And especially don't let bad metadata get in the way of good ideas. A taxonomy is the rules by which we classify things, and this generally involves determining the lists of potential values in metadata fields, like the ones that we just spoke about. This also includes determining the right mix of links in navigation devices throughout an experience. So, working on taxonomy generally involves wrestling with the following concepts: hierarchy, which relationships are best arranged into groups and subgroups; polyhierarchy, which things or types of things might appear in multiple groups or subgroups; Classification. What rules will you use to put things into groups or subgroups? Heterarchy. Which relationships are best shown as unordered or loosely ordered lists? And ontologically. Which relationships are best shown in connection with other related things? So, whether you're arranging pages into a navigation scheme on a website or deciding how to direct people to properly deal with trash disposal in a large office building, taxonomy really matters. And taxonomy really comes down to classification rules. The groups that we choose matter greatly to our audience's ability to make sense of what we are offering to them. Our approach to classification impacts our potential approaches to navigation and use of metadata greatly as well. For example, in this work that I did for children's clothing brand Hannah Anderson, I was able to revise their navigation taxonomy to better align with the customer's experience as well as the brand's long-term vision and strategy. There were two primary changes for this structure. The first structural change was to make room for family matching outside of sleepwear. The company had traditionally only done matching sleepwear, but had recently planned on a matching sweater launch, and this was a big change that was needed to support. The next change was a very big one. It was to lop off the long tail that you can see hanging down that creates a whole new top level category for toddler, separating it from baby. The company itself was divided in ways that grouped babies and toddlers together, but in the consumer mental model, very few shoppers look for toddler clothing in baby, instead, not finding the right sizes in girls and boys. Fun fact, after a few years of this architecture, the team decided to put toddler clothing into boys and girls clothing and eliminate the top level distinction to make room for a growing licensing agreement in character design clothing. So, once again, no architecture is forever. And the last pattern I want to talk through is sequence or process. A sequence is the order in which things are encountered, and a process is a prescribed way of achieving a goal. So, what do ATM machines, food ordering, website development, and teaching kindergarten have in common? They all involve underlying processes without which the ambiguity would totally crush us. Imagine an ATM that always gave you things in a random order, or a restaurant that changed how you order each time you visit. Process are one of the core examples of how, when an information architecture is effective, it's barely noticed at all. But the minute that an IA is messed with, it's all anyone can talk about. Throughout time, we've developed ever more complexifying and globalized processes for how we get things done. And working on one of these processes without understanding it as a whole would never be Plan A at Hindsight Corporation. Yet it is often the case that we are part of a process which lacks a higher level vision. As we close this section together, I want to encourage you to take a magnifying glass and a curious eye to the information architectures that you influence. Which of these patterns do you recognize? Which feel foreign? Do any feel like an opportunity to explore? It's more than likely that you will encounter more than one of these patterns when observing any information architecture. At Etsy, for example, there was a navigation system that highlighted categories of interest to buyers. There was also a deep taxonomy of thousands, yes, I said thousands of categories and subcategories. We were developing graph knowledge to better understand and utilize seller provided metadata, and they were continually improving the tools for buyers and sellers to manage the process of buying and selling handmade and unique goods. It takes all of the patterns that we talked through just now to make most organizations run. Start by identifying them by asking, how do people get around and know where to go in the information architectures that you influence? What metadata is pertinent for the content that you arrange? And how is that data collected, structured, and used? What groups and subgroups exist to arrange people and things into? And what are the rules by which those things and people are classified into groups and subgroups? And what processes or other sequences of events are involved in the information architectures that you influence? Getting familiar with seeing information architectures and labeling them using these patterns can be helpful as you start to become more thoughtful in your own IA practice. If we don't know the word for something, it is harder to get better at it. And in my estimation, a lot of people influence information architectures every day, yet don't know the label for that kind of work yet. With every course and workshop that I teach, I'm hoping to shift some people's mental models about what they thought about IA, or perhaps add a needed and Googleable label for this important everyday practice for others. As I close, I want to encourage you once again to be thoughtful about understanding your role in influencing the information architectures around you. And as I said earlier, I won't claim to know what each of you do, but based just solely on the types of jobs in this organization, I can say IA problems are all around you. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I think we have time left for a few questions if anybody has any.